had most of the building down, and inside was the body of a man.
When Chuck Murphy set about demolishing his derelict cabin in 2015, he never could have expected the project to be brought to a screaming halt when mummified human remains were discovered in one of the chimneys. The discovery of the body was only the beginning, as the rest of the strange scene in the cabin only left the family more desperate for answers.
He was murdered and his body was stuffed in the chimney.
Through exclusive interviews and never-before-seen photos from the police investigation, Iwu hopes to bring new insight to the case. When Woodland Park local Chuck Murphy began demolition on his family's cabin on August 6, 2015, he might have anticipated a difficult day of work, but he never could have predicted what was about to happen.
We had a backhoe, and we had most of the building down, and we were going to tip over the chimney. And when we did, the top of the chimney popped off, and inside was the body of a man.
The body in the chimney was curled up in the fetal position, desiccated and brittle from time and insect activity. This was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to bizarre discoveries.
And the police came and took a look at the whole place and had all kinds of ideas and so forth, but finally found the body, and they determined who the young man was.
Seeking to identify the body, forensic experts compared the teeth with dental records from local missing persons cases. To the shock of investigators, the records matched those of Joshua Maddux, who had remained unaccounted for over the past 7 years. Any lingering doubt was eliminated by the absence of the body's first index finger joint on one hand, as Josh had lost the tip of his finger during childhood. When Josh's father Mike was notified, he said he about had a heart attack. Unfortunately, by the time Josh's body was found, much of the cabin had already been demolished, meaning crucial evidence could have already been lost. However, the police still found more than a few items of interest that took the case from simply strange to truly bizarre. First of all, Josh's body was discovered wearing only a thermal waffle knit shirt. The rest of his clothes, including his shoes, were found inside the cabin. The hearth itself was also an area of interest, as Chuck Murphy reported that the large piece of furniture placed in front of the fireplace did not belong there, nor had he moved it. Josh's remains also raised some concerning questions. His body was totally mummified and showed no external signs of injury. For some reason, his hair was different too. When Josh went missing, he had long hair past his shoulders. The body, however, sported short hair that was only about 1.5 inches long. And then, of course, there was the question of how he got into the chimney in the first place. Chuck, the property owner, said entry should have been impossible. This would become the main point of contention as the case progressed. All the unexplained aspects of the scene obviously demanded investigation. Seeking clarity, the investigators decided to go back to the beginning and revisited what they now had to assume were Josh's last days alive. Josh had been reported missing on May 13, 2008, 5 days after he was last seen by his mother, Roberta. Roberta told police that she'd seen Josh in the kitchen around 11:30 that morning as she headed out the door. When she came back around 20 minutes later, he was gone. She wasn't sure what he was wearing, but noticed that a pair of light-washed jeans and Converse sneakers were missing from his closet. His cell phone, however, had been left behind. It might seem odd to wait 5 days to file a report, but Josh's parents said he had been gone for days at a time before. Most notably, he had decided to hike to Colorado Springs and was gone for 3 days. When he returned, Josh told his family that he'd kept warm by sleeping in hotel lobbies and the post office as he made his leisurely way up the highway. Josh's sister Kate told the Denver Post, "He always told us that he was going to have a great adventure and he may not talk to us for a while. When he said a while, we thought maybe a few years." Not all of Josh's excursions were so successful, however. On one occasion, Roberta had come across her son walking down Highway 115, convinced that it was Highway 24. This, combined with the fact that Josh had been hospitalized nearly a year prior for schizophrenia, led Roberta to fear that Josh could have been lost and hurt. In the end, she turned out to be right, but Roberta's suspicion wouldn't be confirmed for 7 long years. During their initial conversation with police in 2008, Josh's family also noted that it was nearing the anniversary of the loss of Josh's brother, Zach. 2 years prior, Zach had taken his own life, and Josh had reportedly taken his death very hard. However, when the police talked to Josh's two close friends in 2008, they said he'd not behaved unusually when they last saw him or mentioned anything about harming himself. Nonetheless, the police searched the cemetery where Zach was buried in case Josh had gone there but found no sign of him. The canvas expanded to encompass the neighborhood around the family home and nearby campsites. They would only realize years later that a derelict cabin just 2 blocks from the house had been overlooked. When interviewing with the Huffington Post, Josh's sister Kate said, "We looked through every part of the woods we thought he could walk to, but that cabin never came up." The discovery of Josh's body in Chuck Murphy's chimney 7 years later shattered the image Kate held of her brother and left the family with more questions than ever. As previously mentioned, when police arrived on the scene, they found the mummified body in the chimney in the fetal position. Explore With Us conducted an exclusive interview with certified crime scene technician G. Molderig, who explained more about the mummification process.
And so considering that Joshua Maddux was concealed within the chimney for such a long time, he was shielded from the sun, he was shielded from the rain, things of that nature. So it can extend the period of time that it takes for mummification to occur. So I would say probably around 6 to 12 months, just to give everything time to dry out and fully mummify like it was when he was discovered. If there were, say, scratch marks or some kind of sign that he was in there for an extended period of time, he may have tried to pick things away, but because it was knocked down when he was discovered, there's no real source of evidence that could suggest one way or the other that he was there for a shorter period of time or a longer period of time.
Over the years, there's been a lot of misinformation spread, stemming from a statement made by law enforcement that Josh's knees were above his head. Many have taken this to mean that Josh was in the chimney upside down. However, this was not the case. According to the exclusive crime scene photos that Iwu received from the Woodland Park Police Department, Josh's feet were pointed down towards the cabin floor. His body was so tightly curled in the fetal position that his knees were at a higher level than his head, which was tightly folded down towards his chest. Another common misconception is that Josh's legs were disjointed from his torso, but the coroner's report clearly states that apart from regular decomposition and the post-mortem partial amputation of one index finger, there was no obvious damage to the body. In fact, there was so little wrong with the body that even after an autopsy was conducted, the cause of death remained elusive. However, an examination of the body offered a couple of answers. As hair ages, it becomes increasingly brittle. In this case, it's entirely possible that Josh's long hair simply broke away over time, or during the process of demolishing the cabin. According to crime scene expert G. Molderig, the change to Josh's hair could also be ascribed to the decomposition process.
It is possible that animals or birds could have come down the chimney, especially if it was inactive for such an extended period of time, and that could have led to his hair breaking as well as insect activity. And then the last one, but least likely, is the fact that we don't know exactly when he got into the chimney, and we still have to believe that there is a possibility that he received a haircut or got a haircut before he died in the chimney or before his body was in the chimney.
When Josh went missing, he was estimated to be about 150 pounds, but due to mummification, his remains weighed only 29 pounds. The rest of the questions surrounding the case, though, were far more difficult to answer. First and foremost was the question of how Josh got in the chimney. The location of Josh's clothes inside the cabin suggests that he entered the chimney from the interior. Notably, many articles describe the clothes as neatly folded, but this is not specified in the police report. The photos Iwu was able to review also indicate that the clothes were placed on the floor rather than folded. The clothes found inside might have initially seemed like an obvious clue, but as would become the norm for this case, things quickly became more complicated. Chuck Murphy said that one of the first things he noticed when entering the cabin was that a large breakfast bar had been moved in front of the fireplace.
was like 8 feet wide or 10 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and it was a heavy wall was supporting up against the chimney.
It's impossible to say whether it was moved before or after Josh's death. If it was moved before, then it would have obstructed Josh's access to the chimney, meaning he would have had to enter from outside. If he came from outside, though, and became stuck on his way down, how had his clothes gotten inside? In her interview with EWU, certified crime scene investigator G. Mulderig offered her own theory on the issue of the breakfast bar as well.
Based on my knowledge of grief and mental illness, the two combined can cause people to do some pretty strange things that are out of character for them. There is a possibility that he was in a manic state and that he could have possibly moved the breakfast bar to in front of the fireplace in an effort to conceal himself. And it could have been possible that he wasn't able to push the breakfast bar away to get back out.
The alternative was that the breakfast bar could have been moved after Josh's death. Chuck had a chilling theory if this was the case.
He was murdered. He was murdered and his body was stuffed in the chimney.
This might have seemed like a fair conclusion based on the unusual scene, so everyone was likely surprised when the coroner shared his conclusions. Teller County Coroner Al Bourne released a statement asserting that Josh's death had been an accident. Homicide, he said, had been ruled out as there was no evidence of physical trauma. G. Mulderig tended to agree.
Sometimes the lack of evidence is still evidence. So just like if a person has a lack of injuries, that still suggests that they were not injured.
Bourne wrote in his report, most probably at the time he entered the chimney from the top, he did not intend to die, only re-enter the house. Bourne had several theories that stemmed from his belief that Josh had become stuck in the chimney while entering from above. He could have been yelling, but nobody would have heard him, Bourne theorized in a 2015 interview. Houses were quite distant, and they probably wouldn't have heard anything anyway, because the sound would have been muffled because of his location in the chimney. Bourne went on, "It was not an instant death. How he died is only a matter of speculation, but we know he did not starve to death because that takes many weeks. So then you go down the chain and you have dehydration, which can take just a few days, and the other thing would be hypothermia, which could take a day or two. We have no evidence to say which one came first." Hypothermia seemed particularly likely due to Josh's state of undress. In a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, people suffering from hypothermia sometimes begin to feel very hot instead of very cold. This leads them to shed their clothing, which ultimately causes them to succumb to the cold even quicker. Another theory has been raised online too, which G. Mulderig weighed in on.
In regards to positional asphyxiation, I believe that that is something that is possible. It all comes down to the lack of airflow with the positioning of his knees being so close to his chest. If he was constricted in a way that his chest could not fully expand, that is also a way of reducing the amount of oxygen that your body can intake. With that being said, reviewing the medical examiner's report, there were no internal organs that were noted because of the decomposition and mummification. So therefore, being able to determine positional asphyxiation, the medical examiner was not able to do so.
This theory still left questions about the placement of the breakfast bar. Chuck Murphy, the cabin owner, revealed that the breakfast bar was not the only issue with Bourne's theory. In the days following Bourne's ruling that Josh's death had been accidental, Chuck shared something with the potential to change everything.
That fireplace had rebar over the chimney, so no animals could get in.
The rebar, Chuck said, completely blocked the top of the chimney. There was no way Josh could have entered that way and become stuck. There was just one problem. While on scene, no one had seen the rebar Chuck was talking about. Granted, the chimney was half destroyed, but the police had conducted a brick-by-brick search for clues and had definitely not found metal rebar amongst the remains. Bourne suggested that the rebar might have simply corroded over time, rusting away enough to allow entry. Chuck offered a different explanation. He said that as part of the demolition process, all the scrap metal from the cabin had already been collected and taken for recycling. At the time, he and the workers had no reason to suspect its significance. Despite the difference of opinions about the rebar, Al Bourne reopened the case just 3 days after his initial ruling that Josh's death had been an accident. He didn't agree with Chuck that Josh had been murdered. In Bourne's opinion, a single person would not have been strong enough to wedge Josh's 150-pound body in the chimney, especially in the fetal position. Even if someone had managed such a feat, there was no evidence to suggest anyone else had been in the cabin. They had at some point, though. When responding to the call that a body had been found, the police noted that they had previously been called out to the cabin after getting a report of an open door. Chuck Murphy, too, said that the cabin had been broken into a few times in the years it stood empty. The renewed investigation brought with it more concerning information. Allegedly, the police station had been fielding calls reporting people who'd been taking credit for Josh's murder. Additionally, there was one man in particular that many people interested in the investigation thought the police needed to look into. Andrew Andy Newman was originally from Woodland Park, Colorado, where Josh grew up. Andy was only about 2 years older than Josh, and both were allegedly involved in the local music scene. Furthermore, someone claiming to know Andy said that he and Josh had started hanging out together shortly before Josh's disappearance. Then, in late 2009, Josh's close friend reached out to police to say that he heard Josh was with Andy in New Mexico. When the police tracked Andy down there, they made some harrowing discoveries. On May 2nd, 2 men, Anthony and James, invited another man they knew only as Coyote into their apartment. James went to take a shower. When he came out, Anthony lay unresponsive on the couch, having been stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen. In a panic, James removed the knife, which was still lodged in Anthony's chest.
A knife is stuck on his left side. And I grabbed it and I pulled it out.
Meanwhile, Coyote fled on foot. James had recently had major surgery and was unable to give Coyote a chase. He went to a neighbor for help, but by the time paramedics arrived, Anthony was dead. While speaking with police, James also mentioned that Andy confided a warrant might be out for him in Colorado, but he never revealed why. The mysterious Coyote was soon identified by the contents of the backpack he'd left behind, which included 2 things of note. The first was a poem about violently killing someone with a knife. The second were documents belonging to Andy Newman. When police showed Andy's mugshots to James, he confirmed that Andy was the man he knew as Coyote. When police eventually caught up with Andy, he had made his way to Missouri and was fighting extradition back to New Mexico. Based on the recordings EWU obtained, Andy didn't appear to want to discuss his situation with the police. On the other hand, his mother, who still lived in Woodland Park, Colorado, was very forthright and shared something with the possibility to change the perception of the case.
They released him from Pueblo. He was in Pueblo Hospital for 6 weeks in the mental ward. They released him, and they said they couldn't hold him there, they said, because he was not a threat to himself nor anyone else. They were positive of that. He has never been a violent person.
The charges of murder were ultimately dropped in 2011 when James, the sole eyewitness to the crime, died. 4 days after the charges were dropped, Andy made an attempt to escape from jail and was committed to a mental facility to determine whether he was fit to stand trial for the new charge. Andy is currently incarcerated in Florida after being sentenced to 3 years, 1 month, and 8 days in jail for burglary of an unoccupied building. Many online sleuths have latched onto Andy as a suspect due to his extensive criminal history. In addition to the New Mexico, Florida, and Missouri charges, Andy had been charged with harassment and felony child abuse and sex assault in Colorado. When it came to the Josh Maddux case, there were several issues with Andy Newman as a suspect. Most significantly, the authorities couldn't say for certain if he'd even been in the state at the time of Josh's disappearance, nor could they substantiate the rumor that the pair had left the state together. And as Bourne was quick to remind everyone, there was still no evidence that Josh had in fact been murdered. However, some continue to think that Andy should have been investigated harder. Chuck Murphy was among those who remained convinced that Josh's death was far more sinister, and said he was unimpressed with how the investigation was conducted.
It wasn't an accident, it was a murder.
Our crime scene expert and certified investigator G. Molderig added that there were a few additional things she thought could have been investigated at the cabin.
Assuming that nothing was done or nothing further than what was inside the police reports that I have access to. Some things that I would have done investigatively, I would have processed the remaining structure of the scene for latent prints or possible DNA. By doing this would have been able to help us possibly learn if there was someone else or what other people had been visiting the cabin. And then lastly, I would have sent some of the things that could have gone to the laboratory, whether it be to be processed for fingerprints or possible DNA. While they were doing their break-by-break search, a cigarette butt and Mountain Dew can were located. You could either confirm that it was possibly drank by Joshua Maddux or by someone else, and that could have given us an additional identification.
Despite pushback from people like Chuck Murphy, Al Bourne's revised findings listed Josh's cause of death as undetermined. There is so far no answers to a number of things, Bourne said in an interview. It is very confusing. This is probably one of the more tragic ones that we have to deal with. I can't imagine the pain that family went through. There was 7 years before they could bring closure. That interim had to be brutal. Josh's sister Kate concurred, telling the Denver Post, "We'll never really know what happened to him. It's a horror story in my mind to imagine what my brother must have gone through." While the case has officially been closed, the disturbing mystery of how Joshua Maddux lost his life and ended up in Chuck Murphy's chimney is still alive. Maybe someday more evidence will come to light, but it seems most likely that the true circumstances of this puzzling death will remain unknown.